It was a warm Saturday afternoon in Crestwood, a quiet suburban town where life moved at an unhurried pace. Families strolled through the park, children's laughter echoed near the swings, and the scent of fresh produce filled the air at the local farmers market. The sun bathed everything in a golden hue, making the town seem almost picturesque. But for Malik Turner, today wasn't just another weekend. He had been planning for this day for months. Every extra shift at the local coffee shop, every tip carefully tucked away, had led to this moment. His little sister Layla was turning 10, and he wanted her to have something truly special, something that showed her how much he loved her. The silver charm bracelet at Astoria Jewelers was perfect. Malak had passed by the store's gleaming glass windows countless times, imagining the way Layla's eyes would light up when she saw it. Today, finally, he had enough money to buy it. As he approached the store, he adjusted his hoodie, though it was unzipped to reveal a neatly pressed polo shirt. He knew how people sometimes reacted when they saw a young black man in a hoodie, but he shook off the thought. Not today. Just walk in, buy the bracelet, and leave. Taking a deep breath, he pulled open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. A soft chime rang through the store, but instead of the usual warmth of a welcoming customer, a cold, invisible weight settled over him. Something felt off before a single word had been spoken. Astoria Jewelers was exactly what he had expected: sleek glass cases lined with velvet, rows of shimmering gold and silver bathed in bright, almost blinding lights. The faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled the air. The customers inside were mostly well-dressed older women, their diamond rings catching the light as they admired necklaces and earrings that cost more than Malik had made in a year. Their gazes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment, the air felt heavier. A few subtle glances, a pause, and then, as if rehearsed, they turned away. Malik ignored it, keeping his focus locked on the bracelet in the display case. Behind the counter stood Judith Whitman, a middle-aged woman with carefully styled blonde hair and sharp, calculating eyes. At first, her expression was neutral, bored, but the moment her gaze landed on Malik, something shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her grip on the counter tightened ever so slightly. Malik felt it immediately, the weight of that look. That shift. That silent but deafening question hanging in the air. What are you doing here? He had seen that look before, felt the weight of it in places where people like Judith believed didn't belong. But he refused to let it shake him. He stepped forward with a polite smile and pointed at the bracelet displayed inside the glass case. I'd like to see that one, please. His voice was steady, calm, the way his mother had always taught him to speak when dealing with people like this. Judith didn't move. She simply folded her arms and tilted her head slightly. Are you sure? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. That one's quite expensive. Malak's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet and unfolded the cash he had worked so hard to save. I'm sure, he said firmly. I have the money right here. Judith's eyes flicked to the cash, her lips curling slightly as if the sight of it offended her. But instead of relaxing, she tensed even more. Her fingers twitched near the phone resting on the counter. And where exactly did you get all that money? Her voice was casual, but the accusation beneath it was sharp as a blade. Malik stiffened, feeling the weight of her suspicion pressing down on him. Excuse me, he asked, though he already knew where this was going. Judith arched an eyebrow and let out a dry chuckle. It's just, that's a lot of cash for someone your age, she said, her gaze never leaving his face. Did you, borrow it from someone? Maybe find it lying around. Malik inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. I work at Harper's Coffee House, he said, enunciating each word carefully. I saved up for this. Judith made a soft noise of disbelief, shaking her head slightly. Ma'am, she hummed, tapping her nails against the counter. And you expect me to believe that? Malik swallowed, the anger rising in his throat. Yes, he said flatly. Judith let out a dry chuckle, like she had just heard a particularly ridiculous joke. Well, I suppose I should be flattered you thought you could fool me, she said finally, moving toward the display case. But I've been working here a long time, kid. I know when something doesn't add up. Malak's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to unclench them. This was supposed to be simple. Can I just see the bracelet, please, he asked, his patience thinning. Judith sighed as if he were inconveniencing her, but she finally pulled out the velvet tray and placed it on the counter. Be careful with it, she warned sharply. It's worth more than what you probably make in a year. Malik gritted his teeth but said nothing. He reached out gently, picking up the bracelet, feeling the cool silver against his fingertips. It was perfect, exactly what he had imagined. But as he turned it slightly, admiring the way the charms dangled, it slipped. The smooth metal tumbled between his fingers, bounced off the glass counter with a soft clink, and hit the tiled floor below. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, oh my God, I knew it. Judith's voice sliced through the store like a siren. Every head turned in their direction. Malak's breath caught in his throat as the weight of her accusation crashed down on him. I knew you were up to something. Judith jabbed a finger at him, her face twisted in outrage. You were trying to pocket it, weren't you? Thought you'd get away with it. Malak's stomach dropped as he shook his head. No, but Judith had already grabbed the store phone, fingers dialing frantically. You get the police here now, Dow. She barked into the receiver. We've got a thief, young black male. Hootie tried to steal from us. The room went dead silent, but the air was thick with judgment, suspicion, fear. Malak felt their eyes drilling into him, the way a woman clutched her purse a little tighter, the way a man shook his head as if this was just confirmation of what he already believed to be true. Then, in the distance, the wail of approaching sirens. Malak's pulse hammered against his ribs as a sickening dread settled in his gut. He had known this could happen, but knowing it could happen and living it were two entirely different things. Malak stood frozen in place as the distant wail of sirens grew louder. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his hands twitching at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to run, but he knew better. Any sudden movement, any wrong gesture, and this situation could turn from bad to catastrophic. The store had gone silent, but the air was thick with something unspoken, something heavier than the judgmental glances and hushed whispers. The customers who had barely noticed him minutes ago were now watching closely, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and quiet validation. It was as if they had already decided how this story would end. And to them, it was predictable: a young black man in a jewelry store, accused of theft. The siren stopped abruptly outside the store. A rush of air filled the space as the glass door swung open, and two uniformed officers strode in. The taller of the two, Sergeant Bradley, was a heavy-set man in his late 40s with graying hair and a hardened expression. His partner, Officer Reynolds, was younger, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with caution. Judith pointed dramatically at Malik before they could even ask a question. That's him, right there. He tried to steal from me. Her voice carried through the store, and she folded her arms as if daring Malik to deny it. Malek's stomach churned as the words hung in the air, so heavy they felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Sergeant Bradley barely glanced at Judith before his focus snapped to Malik. Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them. His voice was firm, practiced, like this was just another routine incident. But to Malik, it wasn't routine. It was a nightmare unfolding in real time. His breath hitched as his fingers twitched at his sides. He had done nothing wrong. He had no stolen goods, no weapon, nothing suspicious on him, just his own existence in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong assumptions. I didn't do anything, he said, his voice measured, controlled, though his pulse was anything but. Judith scoffed loudly. Oh, please. Are you seriously going to stand there and argue after I caught you? The nerve of you people. She tossed the words out carelessly like she was flinging gasoline onto a fire. Malek flinched. You people. The phrase burned as it landed. He saw the way it landed with the others in the store, saw how no one questioned it. Because in their eyes, she wasn't just accusing him, she was confirming what they already believed. Officer Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicking between Malik and Judith. There was doubt there, uncertainty swimming beneath the surface. But Sergeant Bradley had no hesitation. He stepped forward, already reaching for his cuffs. Sir, step outside with us. His tone wasn't a request. It was an order. Malek's chest tightened as the moment swallowed him whole. He had seen the story unfold before, in viral videos, in news reports, in whispered conversations that left his mother's voice tight with worry. He had seen what happened when young black men refused to comply. And he had seen what happened when they did. His mind spun through the worst possibilities, each one crashing into the next like dominoes. Would they throw him to the ground? Slam his face against the pavement? Would the next headline read, "Teen arrested for attempted jewelry store theft"? Or worse, would it simply read, "Teen shot by police during arrest"? The handcuffs clinked in Bradley's hands. Malik exhaled sharply, forcing his voice to remain steady. Call my mother. Bradley let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Kid, you can make your phone call at the station? No, Malek said firmer now. Call my mother now. Judith rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, sure. Let's call Mommy. What's she going to do? Give us a lecture on fairness. Her voice dripped with mockery, and a few customers exchanged amused glances. Malak ignored her, reaching into his pocket slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate, non-threatening. He pulled out his phone. His fingers steadied despite the storm raging inside him. He dialed. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, a familiar voice answered. Malak. Mom, I need you at Astoria Jewelers. A pause. And then her voice shifted. I'm on my way. Sergeant Bradley sighed loudly. You can call whoever you want, but you're coming with us. He reached forward, snapping one cuff onto Malak's wrist. Malak barely had time to react before the store door burst open again. The sound of heels clicking against the tile floor cut through the tension like a blade. The entire room seemed to shift like gravity itself had tilted toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Naomi Turner, a tall, commanding woman in navy blue suit, her posture rigid with authority. But it wasn't just her presence that made the air in the store feel electric. It was the badge she held up, glinting under the store's fluorescent lights. Her voice was like steel wrapped in velvet. I'm Dr. Naomi Turner, Chief of Police for Crestwood PD. And that young man you're about to arrest, she stepped forward, her gaze cutting through Bradley like a knife, is my son. A silence so thick it felt suffocating settled over the store. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Sergeant Bradley's grip on Malik's wrist faltered. His body, once rigid with certainty, now felt uncertain, exposed. His gaze flickered between Naomi and Malik, processing the implications of what had just happened. Officer Reynolds exhaled sharply, his posture shifting. He had already hesitated before, but now he seemed to fully understand that this wasn't just another routine call. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. But the most violent reaction came from Judith. Her smirk vanished, her posture stiffening, as if she had just been caught playing a losing game. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. But for the first time since this had started, she had no words. Naomi's expression remained unreadable, but there was a dangerous calm beneath it. Sergeant, would you like to explain to me why my son is in handcuffs before you even reviewed the security footage? Bradley shifted on his feet, suddenly less sure of himself. We received a report of an attempted theft, he started, voice clipped, defensive. We responded accordingly. Naomi's head tilted slightly. Accordingly, you mean walking in here, seeing a young black man, and immediately deciding he was guilty. Her voice was quiet, but the authority in it was deafening. Bradley's jaw tightened. That's not what happened. Naomi's expression didn't change. Really? Because it looks a whole lot like that to me. Judith finally found her voice, her words laced with panic. I called because he tried to steal from me. She pointed at Malak, her voice rising. He dropped the bracelet. He was obviously about to take it. Naomi exhaled slowly, turning to Malik for the first time. She hadn't needed to ask him what happened. The exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet rage simmering beneath his composure, told her everything. She turned back to Bradley, her tone smooth as glass before it shatters. Did you check the security footage? Bradley hesitated. Naomi's eyes narrowed. No, you didn't. A deadly pause followed. Then I suggest you do it now. The silence inside Astoria Jewelers was thick, almost suffocating. Sergeant Bradley's jaw clenched as he exchanged a brief, tense glance with Officer Reynolds. The younger officer hesitated, his uncertainty now impossible to ignore. Judith, however, still stood rigid, her expression shifting between panic and defiance. Naomi took a step forward, her heels clicking against the polished tile like a judge approaching the bench. I asked a question, she said, her tone sharp as a blade. Did you check the security footage before putting my son in handcuffs? Bradley's lips pressed into a tight line, but he said nothing. The weight of Naomi's authority hung in the air, an unspoken demand for accountability. Reynolds swallowed hard, glancing at the security monitor behind the counter. His fingers twitched as if debating whether to act on instinct or orders. Finally, he cleared his throat and turned toward Bradley. We should check the footage, he said, his voice cautious but firm. The words landed with the force of a betrayal, and Bradley's eyes snapped to him, dark with unspoken fury. But Naomi's gaze never wavered. And for the first time since entering the store, Bradley seemed to realize he was no longer in control. With a sharp exhale, he jerked his head toward the store manager. The man behind the counter had been frozen in fear, his hands clasped together, so tightly his knuckles were white. He blinked rapidly as if waking from a nightmare, then scrambled toward the back office. The store's customers, once silent spectators, began murmuring amongst themselves. The tension in the room felt like a live wire ready to snap. Judith's fingers twitched at her sides, her confidence slowly unraveling. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, shaking her head. "I know what I saw." Naomi didn't even look at her. Instead, she folded her arms and turned toward Bradley, her expression unreadable. "You see, Sergeant," she said smoothly, "there's a reason we review evidence before making arrests. You don't get to destroy a young man's life based on someone's assumptions." Bradley's jaw ticked, but he remained silent. The minutes stretched into an unbearable eternity as the manager returned with a small remote in his trembling hands. He pressed a button, and the security footage flickered to life on the monitor behind the counter. Every pair of eyes in the room snapped toward the screen. The footage played in crisp black and white, capturing every second of the incident. Malik entered the store, walking calmly toward the counter, his posture relaxed but focused. He spoke to Judith, pointed at the bracelet, and pulled out a neatly folded stack of cash. The moment of truth arrived. The bracelet slipped from his fingers, hit the counter, then bounced onto the floor. The camera angle was clear, undeniable. There was no sudden grab, no attempt to pocket anything, just a simple accident, one that had escalated into something far more dangerous. A ripple of reaction spread through the store like a shockwave. A woman near the back gasped softly, while an older man let out a low, uncomfortable sigh. Officer Reynolds' expression darkened as he exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Bradley's shoulders stiffened, his grip on his cuffs loosening. Judith's face drained of color, her lips parting slightly. This just doesn't prove anything," she sputtered, desperation creeping into her voice. "I know what I saw." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression cold as ice. "No, what you saw was exactly what you wanted to believe," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "And you acted on it without question. You didn't see a customer. You saw a suspect." Judith's mouth opened and closed, but this time she had no defense. Naomi turned her gaze back to Bradley, her expression unreadable. "Now, Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "I assume you have something to say to my son." A tense pause followed, and for the first time, Malik saw uncertainty flicker in Bradley's hardened eyes. His hands flexed at his sides, his usual air of control visibly cracking. He glanced at Reynolds, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Bradley exhaled sharply, then turned toward Malik. His voice was tight, forced. "Son, it looks like there was a misunderstanding." Malik's stomach churned at the word. Misunderstanding. As if the weight of those cuffs had been nothing. As if the fear in his chest had been an overreaction. Naomi arched a brow, her eyes sharp as daggers. "That's not an apology, Sergeant." The words landed like a slap, and Bradley clenched his jaw. His fingers twitched again before he exhaled sharply. "I'm sorry," he said, the words reluctant, clipped. "We should have reviewed the footage before acting." He didn't meet Malik's eyes. He couldn't. Naomi nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. The store remained silent, waiting for what would happen next. Judith's shoulders curled inward, her bravado gone, replaced by shame, wrapped in defiance. But Naomi wasn't done. She took a deliberate step forward, turning toward Judith. "And you, Mrs. Whitman?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. "Do you have something to say?" Judith's throat bobbed, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. The room hung in suspense, waiting for her response. A flicker of something crossed Judith's face: anger, humiliation, maybe even regret, but in the end, pride won out. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and scoffed. "I was just doing my job," she muttered. "I had every right to be cautious." The words landed like a slap. But Malik wasn't surprised. He had known she would never admit she was wrong. Naomi let out a slow, measured breath, shaking her head slightly. "I hope, for your sake, that security footage tells a different story next time," she said, her voice laced with quiet warning. Judith's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. Malik exhaled slowly, his hands finally unclenching. His mother placed a steady hand on his back, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. But as they turned to leave, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that justice hadn't truly been served, because an apology, no matter how forced, would never erase the fear he had felt when those cuffs had locked around his wrists. Malik stepped out of Astoria Jewelers, his breath shaky, uneven. as if the weight of the last 20 minutes had settled deep into his bones. The warm afternoon air should have felt refreshing, but it did nothing to shake the cold grip of reality still clinging to him. His mother walked beside him, her posture rigid, unwavering, yet he could feel the restrained fury radiating off her in waves. Neither of them spoke as they made their way toward her car, the tension between them thick and unspoken. The glass door of the store swung open behind them with a sharp creak, pulling Malak's attention. He turned just in time to see Judith Whitman step outside, her hand gripping the strap of her purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her face was stiff, her lips pressed together, as if she were waging an internal war. For a moment, it almost looked like she was about to say something. But then, just as quickly, she exhaled and shook her head. Whatever battle she was fighting within herself, pride won. She walked away without a single word, her heels clicking against the pavement like the final nails in a coffin. Malik let out a sharp, humorless laugh as he watched her disappear. His mother scoffed, crossing her arms. "Cowards never know how to say they're sorry," she muttered, shaking her head. Malak clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. "I knew she wouldn't," he said, voice flat, devoid of emotion. "People like her never do." The store door opened again, and this time Sergeant Bradley and Officer Reynolds emerged in silence. Bradley didn't look at them, his face set in a tight mask of frustration, as if the entire incident had been an inconvenience rather than a mistake. Reynolds, on the other hand, hesitated for half a second, his jaw tightening before he forced himself to look away. They both walked toward their squad car and without a word drove off. Malak exhaled through his nose, watching them go. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "They just walk away like nothing happened?" Naomi turned to him, her sharp eyes studying his face carefully. "For now," she said simply, but there was a dangerous edge to her tone. Malak turned back toward the store one last time. Through the window, he could see customers going back to browsing, the same ones who had stood by and watched everything unfold. As if just minutes ago, they hadn't seen a young black man nearly get arrested for a crime he never committed. His stomach twisted at the sight. "I just wanted to buy a bracelet," he muttered, his voice heavy. Naomi sighed, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "I know, baby," she murmured, her grip firm, grounding him. Malik took a deep breath, then exhaled, his shoulders loosening just slightly. They got into the car, but neither of them spoke as Naomi started the engine. The soft hum of it tilled the air between them, the weight of the moment still pressing down on them both. Outside, Crestwood carried on as if nothing had happened. People walked by, cars pulled into parking spots. The sky remained the same shade of indifferent blue. But inside, Malik could still feel the heat, the Hudis accusations, the tight grip of Bradley's cuffs, and the unshakable truth that no matter what, this wasn't over. His mother finally broke the silence, her voice softer now, lacking the sharp authority she had wielded inside the store. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked. Malik stared at the dashboard, his fingers drumming lightly against his jeans. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I feel angry and tired, and like none of this really matters, because tomorrow it'll be someone else in my place, and no one's going to stop to ask if they're okay." Naomi inhaled deeply, her hands tightening on the wheel before she forced herself to relax. "I know," she murmured. "It's a cycle that keeps repeating. But today we fought back. Today you didn't let them break you." Malik let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Didn't I?" His voice was sharp. Edge was something Naomi recognized all too well, the exhaustion of fighting a battle you never chose. He turned toward her, frustration burning behind his eyes. "I stood there while she talked about me like I was nothing. Well, everyone just let it happen. And even when she got caught, even when she knew she was wrong, she still couldn't say the words." Naomi didn't answer right away. She stared straight ahead, her lips pressed together in a tight line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but unshakable. "By refusing to let them define you," she said. "By making sure that no matter what they see when they look at you, you know who you are. By showing them, over and over again, that they're wrong even when they refuse to admit it." Malak clenched his jaw. Looking out the windows wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. But maybe it was all they had. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, heavier, more settled. Naomi reached into her purse, pulling out her phone, and Malik frowned as she scrolled through her contacts. When she pressed a name and lifted the device to her ear, he narrowed his eyes. "Who are you calling?" he asked, wary. Naomi didn't answer right away. She waited, her expression unreadable. as the line rang. Then, after a pause, she spoke. Cynthia, I need a press release prepared immediately. Her voice was smooth, controlled, but deadly serious. Malak's breath hitched slightly. Regarding Astoria Jewelers, she continued. I want a full investigation into the call that was made to dispatch, and I want an internal review on Sergeant Bradley. I also want a public statement on racial profiling and misuse of emergency services, and make sure the media knows exactly what happened today. Malak's eyes widened slightly. You're really going after them? Naomi lowered the phone slightly, giving him a knowing look. You think I was just going to let this go? Malak exhaled, something between relief and disbelief settling in his chest. He had spent so long watching stories like his unfold the same way someone gets profiled, humiliated, accused, and then nothing happens. But this felt different. This felt like a fight that wasn't ending the moment they walked out of that store. Naomi lifted the phone back to her ear. Oh, and Cynthia. Make sure Judith Whitman's name is included in the statement. If she thought she could do this without consequences, she was mistaken. Malak let out a slow breath, glancing down at his hands. Maybe justice wasn't always immediate. Maybe it didn't come neatly packaged with an apology. But sometimes justice looked like accountability, and this time he wasn't the one who had to carry the weight of it alone. 3 days later, Astoria Jewelers was everywhere. News stations ran headline after headline about the incident. Social media exploded with outrage, and the store's Yelp page was flooded with one-star reviews. Some called for a boycott, while others demanded Judith Whitman be fired immediately. The pressure was relentless, and the fallout had only just begun. Naomi's press release had done exactly what she intended. It forced people to pay attention. The police department announced an internal investigation into Sergeant Bradley's handling of the case. The mayor's office released a statement condemning racial profiling and the misuse of emergency services. And as for Judith, she had been placed on indefinite leave, though rumors swirled that she had actually been fired. Malak scrolled through the news on his phone, his fingers hovering over article after article. He should have felt victorious, but all he could think about was how easily things could have gone the other way if his mother hadn't been who she was. If Reynolds hadn't hesitated, if there hadn't been security cameras. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter, his little sister's laughter. Layla bounced onto the couch beside him, grinning as she waved her wrist excitedly. The silver charm bracelet gleamed under the living room lights, the tiny charms jingling softly as she moved. Malak, look what Mom got me, she squealed. Malak barely had time to react before she threw her arms around him, squeezing him tight. His chest tightened, his breath catching slightly. He had wanted so badly to be the one to give it to her. Layla tilted her head, frowning slightly. I thought you were going to get it. Malak hesitated, his eyes flicking toward their mother, who stood nearby, watching carefully. Naomi had bought it for him, making sure Layla still got her gift despite everything. But stepping foot back in that store, seeing Judith's face reliving the weight of that moment, it had been too much. He forced a small smile, nodding. I picked it out, he said finally. That's what matters, right? Layla's grin returned instantly. Right, she chirped, hugging him again before dashing off to show their mom. Naomi met Malak's gaze from across the room, her expression knowing but gentle. She didn't push, didn't force him to talk about what he wasn't ready to. Instead, she simply sat down beside him, their shoulders barely touching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the air between them. It wasn't just about Astoria Jewelers or Judith Whitman, or even Sergeant Bradley. It was about the bigger picture, the reality that this had never just been about a bracelet. Naomi sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. You know, when I was your age, my father gave me the same advice I gave you that day, she said quietly. Don't let them define you. Don't let them win. Malak let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. And does it ever get easier? Naomi was silent for a moment. Then she exhaled deeply. No, she admitted. But we keep fighting anyway. Malak nodded slowly, his gaze flicking back to his phone. The world had seen what happened to him. They had listened. They had cared. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder for how long. Would they still care next week? Next month? Next year? Or would his story just become another cautionary tale in a long, endless cycle? Naomi must have seen the thoughts swirling behind his eyes because she leaned in slightly, her voice gentler now. You made a difference, Malak. He scoffed, shaking his head. Did I? Naomi didn't flinch. Yes, he wanted to believe her. He really did. But for now, all he could do was sit in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened. The headlines would eventually fade. The outrage would die down. The world would move on. But Malak wouldn't. He would remember. And next time, he would be ready. This story isn't just about a bracelet. It's about perception, power, and the unshakable reality that some people will judge you before they ever know you. Malak walked into that store with nothing but good intentions. Yet he walked out carrying a weight far heavier than he should have, the weight of being seen as guilty before being given a chance to be innocent. And let's be honest, this happens every day. Maybe not in a jewelry store. Maybe not over a bracelet. But in boardrooms, classrooms, job interviews, and street corners, how many times have we seen someone profiled, doubted, or silenced just because of how they look, where they come from, or who the world assumes they are? But here's the truth: you are not defined by their assumptions. You don't owe anyone an explanation for simply existing. You don't have to carry the shame of their ignorance. But you do have the power to demand better, to fight back, not with fists, but with truth, to expose the lies, to challenge the bias, to refuse to accept injustice as just the way things are. Malak's mother knew this fight well, and she taught him the most important lesson of all: when the world tries to write your story for you, pick up the pen and write it yourself. You are more than what they see, more than what they assume. And the only way to break the cycle is to keep showing up, keep proving them wrong, and keep making sure they have no choice but to see you for who you really are.